My name is Elin and I have always been proud of my life of order and harmony. At 45, I am still in shape, I still exercise, and my career as a doctor brings me not only professional satisfaction, but also allows me to remain an attractive and self-confident woman. It would seem, what more could one want? But one incident that happened at the beginning of this summer turned my usual reality upside down. This summer, Jeri, the son of my late husband's daughter, came to my house. He's 25, tall, muscular, and always has a spark of sass in his gaze. Jeri visited me often, and I always felt his presence filled the house with life. But this summer his visit was special. He showed up in the late afternoon, as always, with a wide smile. We hugged on the doorstep, and I noticed that his touch was a little more confident than before. I didn't pay much attention to it, but the feeling of something new had already settled inside. The next day, while I was making a light dinner in the kitchen, Jeri called out to me from the bathroom. His voice sounded tense. "Elin, could you get me a towel?" I took the towel and went upstairs. When I got to the bathroom door, it was ajar. With a light knock, I stepped inside. Jeri was standing with his back to me, naked, and water was running down his body. I felt my breath catch for a moment. "Grandma, why did you come in?" he said, turning around and immediately covering himself with his hands. "Jeri," I began with a slight smile, "you have a beautiful body. There's no need to be embarrassed." I walked out, leaving the towel on the edge of the sink. My heart was pounding frantically in my chest, but I tried to look calm. I could feel the tension between us, a thin, almost imperceptible line that was scary but exciting to cross. Later, at dinner, we both pretended that nothing had happened. Conversations were light, but I caught Jeri's occasional glances at me, as if studying me. There was something new in his gaze, something that made me excited and scared at the same time. When night fell, I went to bed, but sleep never came. Words and images kept running through my head. Why couldn't I get that moment in the bathroom out of my mind? I felt it was more than that. The next morning, I decided to get Jeri to help me with the household chores. I leaned over the washing machine, deliberately pretending I couldn't get something out of the drum. "Jeri, Jeri," I called out, trying to keep my voice casual. He came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway, frowning. "Look, I think I'm stuck," I said with a slight smile. Leaning in even deeper, Jeri stepped closer, and that's when I felt his hand on my waist. His touch was confident, but tentative. "Are you always this helpless? Why are you even doing this?" he asked jokingly, but his voice sounded low, almost hoarse. "Come on, help me," I teased, returning to my pose. My words pulled him out of his confusion, and he stepped closer. "I'm trying," he said quietly, sliding his hands down my sides cautiously, like he was afraid of doing something wrong. His touch was warm and nervous, which only added to the tension of the moment. "Grandma, why did you do that? I can't concentrate properly," finally burst out of him. His words sounded like a confession, full of tension and inner conflict. His gaze, full of confusion and repressed emotion, met mine for a moment and then lowered again. Suddenly he grabbed my hand and pulled me toward him. His movements were abrupt, but there was some passionate urgency in them. I felt his breathing quicken, his face close. His scent, his touch, even the sound of his breathing, it made me forget everything in the world. When he looked at me, there was a storm of emotion in his gaze, as if he were trying to realize something new and different about himself. His body language said more than words could. Jeri looked like he was struggling with himself, with his own thoughts and what had just happened. It was evident in the way he shifted nervously from foot to foot, shaking his head slightly as if he were trying to get rid of an intrusive thought. The silence between us thickened into a tension that could have been cut with a knife. The air felt electric, and the room itself seemed to shrink, leaving us alone with each other. We both felt that there had been a turning point that we dared not voice. It was as if an invisible thread stretched between us, pulling our fates ever closer. I need to take a shower right away," he finally squeezed out, rising abruptly. His voice sounded hoarse, like he was barely holding back. Jeri disappeared behind the bathroom door, and I was left standing in the middle of the room, feeling a wave of unknown emotions wash over me. I knew that he wanted to escape this tense situation, to get away from his thoughts, from himself. But at the same time, I felt that this escape was in vain. No matter where he went, our paths would cross again, because I wouldn't let this moment go nowhere. As the bathroom door closed behind him, I heard the sound of water mixing with a rhythmic pounding. Curiosity possessed me, as if this was a mystery to be solved. I stepped closer and, ducking slightly, peered through the narrow slit in the keyhole. My heart froze. I saw Jeri standing under the jets of water. He was alone, completely immersed in his thoughts and actions. His movements were so natural and open that I felt like a trespasser. But at the same time, it was impossible to tear myself away. Excitement mixed with intrigue into an extraordinary sensation. My chest heaved as I took a deep breath. His face, reflected in the mirror, expressed concentration and something else, elusive but incredibly appealing. I felt my fingers shake as I tried to keep myself from doing something impulsive. Still, I couldn't help myself. The doorknob turned slowly under my fingers, and I stepped in. A sharp sound broke the silence of the bathroom. Jeri turned around, his eyes wide, his face pale and then flushed. "What are you doing?" He exhaled, trying to hide behind the nearest towel. His voice sounded both confused and nervous at the same time. He avoided my gaze, as if that could fix what had just happened. "Didn't I say I could come in here whenever I wanted?" I said confidently, not averting my eyes. I was calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, even though I was seething inside. Jeri was silent, clearly unsure of what to say. I took a step closer, feeling the tension between us reach its peak. It was an odd mixture of embarrassment, slight panic, and something he couldn't seem to figure out himself. "You can keep going," I added quietly, looking him straight in the eye. His face flashed, and he lowered his gaze. I can't. "This is wrong," he whispered, and I saw his fingers clench convulsively on the edge of the towel. "Why is it wrong?" "I mean, we're adults, Jeri. Or do you think this is just a game?" My words sounded like a challenge. I could see him struggling with himself, his face giving away his inner conflict and his breathing becoming more frequent. "I don't know how to explain it," he finally said, his voice shaking. "But seeing you here, like this, it confuses me." I took another step, and he stepped back, as if I might hurt him. But I knew it was all just fear. Not fear of me, but fear of his own desires. "Are you afraid of me?" I asked, barely holding back a smile. Jeri shook his head, avoiding my gaze. "No. I'm afraid of myself." His words came out quietly but confidently. And in that moment, I realized that his resistance wasn't a rejection, but a last line of defense. We stood opposite each other while time stood still. It was a game on the edge of fear, desire, and intense intimacy. And each of us knew that the next step would change everything. The water from the shower ran down his skin, cascades of spray turning into a veil that hid us from reality. I stood still, feeling every cell in my body throbbing. He turned around, noticing me, and I caught a mixture of surprise and uncertainty in his gaze. But something else, something deeper, sparked in his eyes, to a subtle spark that made my hands shake. His lips opened slightly, as if he was about to say something but couldn't. Instead of words, there was tension between us, like an electrical charge that was impossible to ignore. I took a step forward, and we were on the edge, the very edge where reason screams, no, and something much older, primal, pulls us toward the inevitable. Without realizing what I was doing, I leaned in, letting myself touch his lips. It was instantaneous, like a lightning strike. I expected resistance, perhaps even anger, but instead I felt him respond, tentatively but with growing passion. The hot water washed away all barriers, leaving just the two of us in this moment that seemed to last forever. I wanted to continue this moment, and I did something he'd never thought I'd do. Good thing I'd had enough experience. I looked down at him and watched him roll his eyes as I continued my rhythmic movements. When I got back to the living room, my thoughts were flitting around like frantic birds. The events in the bathroom weren't settling in my head, but they weren't letting go either. I ran my hand through my damp hair, feeling the traces of his touch on my skin. I couldn't sit still on the couch. The sensation of his gaze and touch, which held so many undisclosed emotions, wouldn't leave me. He came out of the bathroom, dressed, but his hair was still wet and his face retained traces of his recent shock. He stopped in the doorway, as if hesitant to enter, and our gazes met. I suddenly found it hard to breathe. Words seemed unnecessary, but I broke the silence. "Are you okay?" My voice sounded hoarse, like I was short of breath. He nodded, stepping closer. His steps were slow, almost cautious, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile between us. When he sat down next to me, there was only a tiny gap between us. I felt his warmth, and it was almost unbearable. Why? He started to speak, but stopped, biting his lip. I could see him struggling with himself, trying to find the words. Because I couldn't help it, I answered, stepping ahead of him. The words were out of my mouth before I could think about them, and I felt his gaze grow harder. His hand came up tentatively, touching my cheek. The touch was light, almost weightless, but I froze as if it were the most important thing in the world. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The rays of the setting sun gilded the walls of the room, giving everything around me a soft, warm glow. Jeri leaned over, his shoulder touching mine as if by accident, but the gesture was imbued with something more. It was so natural that I froze for a moment, feeling my heart speed up treacherously. He laughed a light, hearty laugh that instantly dispelled the tension. His voice was full of surprising warmth, as if he was trying to turn this moment into something comfortable rather than frightening. But there was a spark hiding in his gaze that kept me on edge. "You're amazing, you know?" His words came out so suddenly that I was confused. I wanted to answer, but my tongue felt like it was stuck to my palate. No matter how hard I tried to keep my cool, heat flared through my cheeks, betraying my embarrassment. Jeri smiled wider, then leaned closer and added quietly, "Everything about you is beautiful, every detail." His voice sounded too sincere to be an act. For a split second, I felt all the barriers I'd so carefully built around myself disappear. I tried to grin to hide the emotion, but I couldn't. The feeling of someone finally seeing me for who I was too strong. We sat in silence for a long time, savoring the silence, which now seemed full of meaning. But when Jeri suddenly touched my cheek, I couldn't help myself. His touch was soft, barely perceptible, but it sent warmth through my body. I didn't even realize I was reaching for him, as if the gesture was inevitable. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I asked quietly, my voice trembling. "Because you're beautiful." His answer was so simple that it made my chest ache. "And I want you to know that." His words shattered the last remnants of my resistance. How could I have turned a blind eye to what was happening between us for so long? How long had I tried to ignore those feelings, hiding them under a mask of indifference? But now it's clear. In that small moment when our gazes met, I realized I couldn't pretend anymore. When Jeri gently leaned over and kissed my cheek, I felt everything inside me freeze. The gesture was so simple, so beautiful, that it was all his sincerity. But at the same time, I felt him reveal something that had long been hidden behind walls of inhibitions and doubts. I didn't answer him with words. Instead, I let myself smile, an honest, genuine smile, like I hadn't smiled in a long time. This moment was more than just a casual display of affection. It was the beginning of something new, real and genuine. Jeri leaned back, but his gaze still didn't leave me. There was no tension or uncertainty in it anymore. There was a calmness and a feeling that we both understood without words. "Thank you," I whispered finally, feeling my words dissolve into silence, but still reaching him. His smile was the answer. It was so genuine that I suddenly realized this wasn't the end, just the beginning.